I'm honored to be with all of you tonight, and especially with our panelists here as we engage, I think, in one of the most important and critical conversations facing the city today, and not just this city. But I know that, as Hoy mentioned earlier, we have been awash in two significant reports and their recommendations over the last year and a half or so. And I'm referring, of course, not just to the Mayor's Task Force report that Lori so ably chaired, but also the recent report from the Department of Justice. Those each have more than 100 recommendations. They go into great detail demonstrating the challenges facing policing in our city today. And what we are going to do now is not go back through the litany of those, but really try and talk about where are we on this process of reform, what needs to happen, what are the barriers, and what are the roles that all of us can play in that process. So with that as a jumping off point, Lori, let me start with you and say we've had a lot of attention placed on Chicago over the last really 2 years. Where are we in the process of responding to the recommendations that you and many others have highlighted?
Well, I think we've made some significant strides, but there's still a lot of work to do. One of the questions that I'm sure we'll get to over the course of the evening is what's going on with the Department of Justice, and are we going to see a consent decree? I think one of the challenges in the absence of a consent decree, and I'm one who doesn't think that that's going to happen, I'd be delighted to be surprised, but the two things I think that are important about a consent decree that are critical for us to actually move forward in fourth gear or fifth gear, not just second gear, which is where I think we are right now, is a consent decree requires a focus and dedication of resources and personnel on reform. It's not part-time, it's a full-time focus that's directed by a judge and directed by a monitor. The other thing that a consent decree, I think, brings is a requirement that the city expend the resources that are necessary to advance reform. I think that the department, particularly in announcing its 2017 plan for reform, laid a very good foundation for change. I supported that. Stood up with the superintendent in support of the rollout of that. I think the use of force policy that was announced last week was a really important milestone. But there's so many other pieces of reform that both the task force identified and the Department of Justice identified that aren't being done, in part because it's a real strain on resources within the department. So I don't mind saying this, and I've said it to the superintendent, there's got to be a bazaar of reform, if you will. I'm encouraged by Walter Katz being here. Laura Kennard has recently been confirmed as the public safety IG, but there's got to be more resources that are brought to the department itself in order to move aggressively to tackle the challenges that still remain.
I want to talk more about this consent decree and the implications there, but give me one or two examples of the kinds of things that need more focus and more resources to make them a reality.
Well, a couple of things. One of the obvious, and I think I've talked to many people about that even tonight, there's got to be more effort, systematic made to bridge the gap between the community and the police department. You know, from day one, I think Superintendent Eddie Johnson himself really personally extended a significant amount of resources and continues to do so to reach out to people all across the city, which is important and obviously necessary. But until we get to the point where individual police officers recognize that a respectful constitutional engagement with individual community members is every bit as important a tool as their badge or gun, we are not going to have made the kind of change and transformative change that we need to. So that's one. And I think that could happen in different circumstances. The other thing I think, and I'll pick on my pet peeve, we can't keep spending tens of millions of dollars every single year on settlements and judgments related to the police department. I mean, that's just unsustainable. And that has got to change. There's got to be a commitment to make sure that are things and structures that are in place to change that. I could go on and on about why that's important and what needs to change, but all of you who are citizens of the city of Chicago, your taxpayer dollars are going to fund settlements and judgments that the police department has no skin in the game for. It doesn't affect their budget. We go out into the barn market at our terrible interest rates and spend bond money on paying off settlements and judgments. And that $30 million figure from 2016 doesn't include the lawyers' fees that we're paying, the city's paying for lawyers who are defending the city in these actions. That's got to change, and that's got to be made a priority by the mayor's office and by the mayor himself and the law department to make a significant dent in those numbers, and to have a feedback loop, I'll borrow from my friend Maurice Clausen, to make sure that the things that the lawyers at Corporation Counsel are seeing, the problems in training, the frequent flyers who are constantly named as defendants, there's some institutional response to the problems that are identified in that litigation.
To identify and root out
Yeah,
or address those officers of the wrongdoing.
In the Northern District of Illinois alone, which is the federal courts here, we have at any given time 400 to 500 pending lawsuits against the city and the police department. That dwarfs by hundreds the number of lawsuits on similar grounds at any other district across the city. We shouldn't be leading in those kinds of indicators.
I want to get Tanya in on the community piece, but T, just in passing, those kinds of figures, how does that compare to your experience in a city like Arlington or your work with other jurisdictions around the country?
There is no comparison with my experience in Arlington. There are some other cities in the country that are problematic, that do have high numbers of lawsuits, but many of those cities are also in consent decrees. And let me say something about consent decrees, Lori. You started the conversation here. Police reform is very difficult. Mm-hmm. It's very hard. And you know, everybody talks about the CPD needing reform. Well, the problems didn't just start a couple of years ago, right. But the problem started in 1835. And so we have years and years and years of problems and culture that has built up to this point. If the CPD could fix its own problems, it probably would, but it can't. It takes more than just the police department. It takes more than just resources to address and repair the problems in the police department.
Why do you say a department like the CPD can't fix itself?
Well, because my experience is that many of the police officers, if not most, and police commanders want to do a good job. But policing has its own culture, and by and large, the problems in police departments are endemic in policing, and it takes external influences. It takes members of the community. It takes transparency within the department in order for the problems to be exposed and help to come in to help show the department what the art of the possible is, what can be, what should be, and to help create the kinds of reform that must be in order to engage in democratic policing. The department itself can't do it. It takes external resources to do that.
Well, I don't want to lose the question that you said, or the point you made at the outset, which is it seems unlikely that we'll get that from the federal government through the force of a consent decree, which raises the question of where might that come. But Tanya, just given your work here, you've talked to us in the past about seeing this not as a question of reform, but of accountability, echoing one of the points that Lori made. What's the distinction you draw there, and why is it important?
I get a tremendous amount of tension when I hear the term police reform. Police reform, when someone asks me, what will it take to reform police, it sounds very similar to me if someone were to ask me, how do you become best friends with a tiger, right? The answer is you don't, right? You cage a tiger, you keep it from harming folks, or you stay far away from it. A tiger it thrives off killing. That's how it lives, right? So it's designed to kill. If we look at police departments and the institution of policing, it thrives off the criminalization of communities. So to think that you can go in and reform or change this practice that, as T said, has gone on for many, many years, which is functioning in the way that it was intended, I think a more compelling question is, how do we redefine what safety means for communities? How do we reimagine what public safety actually is? I'm very confident in police accountability. I think that is a very public process. That's a process that needs to happen with the input of directly affected individuals. But changing the police department as it has functioned for years will be a process that will be an extremely long process, and I think that the results will be short term. I think that we really have to think about what it means to be safe.
Lori, I know you want to jump in here.
Yeah, I think we have to have a little more hope than that. And I hear what you're saying. The issues that have come to light over the last couple of years regarding our police department are long-standing. There's no question about that. The voice that members of the community have found when they were marching in the street after the release of the video are really giving voice to issues that have gone back and resonate for us going back decades, back to, frankly, the police departments all over this country being used to enforce the horrible discriminatory practices of Jim Crow. But what I also think about and what gives me hope and pushes me forward is I think about the kids in the neighborhoods who too many of whom grow up in fear. When in March we had that 1 week where a 2-year-old and 2 preteen girls were killed just living their lives with violence. I can't accept the notion that we can't embrace reform of our police department because our lives literally depend on it. And how the success of the police department really makes a difference in the quality of life of individual citizens. And so while we obviously have lots of issues with the way that our police department has gone about its business for way too long, while we have borne witness to practices and policies that are antithetical to a constitutional, respectful police force, I can't give up hope of making significant structural change for the long term, because I think about those kids in those neighborhoods who deserve quality policing to keep them safe.
What's your response?
Right.
Yeah.
I'd actually like to respond to that. It's not that I don't have hope. Actually, my daughter is one of those children that lives in one of those neighborhoods. So I appreciate the fact that you brought up those young people living in those communities. And I just don't have confidence in the process that is happening now under the current leadership, because I don't think that their view of what it takes to transform communities is quite broad enough.
And tell me more about what that would take. What should it look like,
Absolutely.
ideally?
So when we look at how police relate to folks in our community, right? For those of us who are directly impacted, Lori talked about the protesters and the people who have been out in the streets. Many of them are here tonight, who have been on the front lines, fighting for this issue as well as criminal justice reform overall for several years. Yep. Yet last week, there was a young man who was held down by police and beaten in the face, right? So what we see reflected in our communities, what we feel, does not say that there's been really any work done, that there's a lot of conversation. We're caught in a process of trying to figure things out. When GAPA went into communities and actually talked to folks about what real police accountability looked like, they had amazing ideas. They had ideas that were not confined to just the police department. They talked about, how do you make a difference in communities? What are the problems that are causing this influx of crime? A report just came out that said young black men were 7 times more likely to be jobless than white men, right? So if you go to any community, if you go to Inglewood, if you go to Lawndale, if you go to Aguiar Gardens, and you go to a kindergarten class and you ask those kids, what do you want to be when you grow up? Not one of them will say, you know what, I want to be a drug dealer. I want to be a kingpin. They say, I want to be doctors. I want to be a lawyer. I want to be teachers. What are the barriers that we are creating that makes them turn to a life of crime, that makes those dreams unattainable? How do we get kids on the right path so they will have opportunities in their community? We just closed how many schools, right? This does not actually contribute to keeping communities safe. So there is a cycle of poverty, which leads to a cycle of violence, which is responded to by over-policing. So unless we respond to all of those issues, I believe that we'll be caught up in the same cycle. We'll be having these conversations 20 years from now over and over again.
T, you've felt the same way. you feel this needs a much bigger, broader lens of investment, correct?
Absolutely. Steve, policing, as I said before, police departments by themselves cannot do the job. It is a much bigger picture, and it's going to take a lot more people than just the police officers, the police administration, and it takes more than police accountability to get there. But in cities all over the world, in war-torn countries even in the world, it's the police, not the military, who are the backbones and the bases of stability in those regions. In a democratic society, you have to have a strong, effective, functioning police department in order to have stability, to bring quality of life into communities. And so I think there is no question about the essence of policing, but what we need is a police department that adheres to constitutional rules and regulations and practices. We need it in Chicago, need it in New York, need it all over the United States. And so I think that's the goal, to bring that kind of policing to a city and to communities who deserve nothing less than constitutional policing. I think we can't say it's impossible. We have to have hope. And if we're saying that we cannot bring constitutional policing to the city of Chicago, then we're saying democracy doesn't work. Right. And I'm not ready to give up like that.
Well, I want to get specific on, absent a consent decree, how do you get there? What are the ingredients?
It's hard. It takes, first, a federal judge has the force of law behind them in enforcing a consent decree. A federal judge with the Department of Justice as one of the conveners at the table has that force to bring resources, to force cities to bring resources, mayors to bring resources, police chiefs to apply resources to meet the ends of the consent decree. Now, without a federal judge, we have to have committed leadership. We have to have leadership that's collaborative. We have to have leadership who that is working together and willing to set aside personal, private agendas, ready to set aside everything in favor of what a consent decree would require, and that's the public interest. We got to set aside those personal agendas in order to meet the requirements of what the consent order would be.
Are there other strategies absent a consent decree that help us get there?
Yeah, I think, the lawyer in me says, look, we know what the structure is. We know the specific items that need to be addressed. Is it possible for the city to articulate a document and a set of standards that it's going to reach, that it's going to make a budgetary commitment to meet those standards in a specific timeline, and then we let Laura Kennard and her team at the IG's office be the overseer and report out to determine whether or not the police department and the other police board, COPA, whatever else, are meeting those marks? Yeah, I think it's possible to replicate some elements of a court-enforced consent decree if there's a will to do that. But I think the point is well taken. I think it's going to be difficult for the police department to replicate the resources, the commitment, the focus on its own without some outside assistance. I think it's going to be very challenging.
One of the things that you made reference to in your remarks earlier challenged this notion that we've heard echoed in the political conversation, which is to say, essentially, you can either increase public safety, reducing murders in Chicago, or you can have police accountability. You can't do both. You say not only can you do both, but these two things are interrelated. What do you mean?
Well, because we're in polite company, I won't use the word bullshit, but the notion that we have these two competing and seemingly intractable concepts that if you are pro-reform, pro-accountability, you're anti-police, and you can't be pro-public safety and pro police if you harbor these notions of reform and constitutional policing. That's nonsense. The two go hand in hand. I mean, again, think about the instance where those 3 kids were killed over that 1-week period. What happened there? What happened was Andrew Holmes, Father Flager, and other activists literally went door to door to generate leads and witnesses to help solve those murders. They're not solved without community engagement. And I'll credit Father Mike, who said, we have to have our faith overcome our fears. We have to get to a point where we take steps in the direction of each other. Absolutely, the police department, I think, has the major role to play, right? But we as citizens empower them to act. And that's why, when I said before in response to Tanya's earlier comments, we should not cede our responsibility to make sure that our police department, with a $2 billion a year budget, outside of the amount of money that we spend on settlements and judgments, is acting in a way that is consistent with the basic tenets of our democracy. We give them the consent, and we can withhold that consent. We can modify that consent, but we cannot turn our back on making sure that one of the most important institutions in our city reflects our values. And we have ceded that ground, and we have to do everything every single day to reclaim it.
Tanya, from your standpoint, what impact would improved accountability have on trust between police and the communities that they are
That's an excellent
stationed
question. It's very hard for folks, especially when we talk to them, to really envision a different kind of world, right? It's one thing to talk about ensuring that police are held accountable when they harm citizens, and another conversation, how do we live in a world where police don't harm citizens, right? So, we're having this conversation, and I don't think that it's necessarily bold enough, because we haven't talked about the racism and the anti-blackness that exists within the police department that has to be called out, right? How marginalized communities are treated, have been historically treated, and pushing our public safety officials to not only call that out, but weed those people out of the process. I don't want a racist trained not to harm me, right? I don't want to encounter a racist when I'm in distress. So how are we looking at our police officers? Who are we putting on the streets in our communities? Those types of things matter on the front end first, and then accountability is also very important. When those folks slip through the cracks and the wrong things happen and people are harmed, how are they held accountable? How are they not protected? We're looking at things like the police contract, how they protect police officers. They have protections that private citizens do not get. They get the opportunity to change stories over time. They get the opportunity to know who files a complaint against them. If you file a complaint anonymously, it's very likely that it will go nowhere. So people are not always transparent about the interactions that they're having with police. So until we start removing some of those protections, we won't even hear the stories of harm in order for people to be held accountable. So there's an entire process that we have to get to that accountability.
There's so much there that I want to pick up on, but that last piece around the provisions in the police contract, you've highlighted it in the report, the DOJ highlighted it, others have highlighted in their reporting on this. How critical is it to make headway? And given the politics of the FOP and their new president, what's the likelihood that some reforms and some changes can be made through that process?
Well, I don't know, is the truthful answer. I would like to think that some of the more inflammatory statements that Kevin Graham, the new FOP president, has made were part of the campaign rhetoric, and we'll see what the reality is once they get to the negotiating table. But I think it's incumbent upon us as citizens, and I've been very outspoken in calling upon the mayor, Ed Siskel, our relatively new corporation counsel, to articulate a set of values that they are bringing to these negotiations. Of course, the negotiations are going to be in private. We don't expect them to be out in public view or around a table, but I think it's critically important that the mayor articulate what values he is empowering his negotiators to bring to that table, and we haven't heard that yet.
That
And
he
that's
should
critically
say that
important.
to the citizens
Absolutely.
of Chicago.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We need to know that. We need to hear from them on that. There's a range of technical changes that need to be made, but really going back to, I think, the time of Jane Byrne, when these collective bargaining agreements were first put into play, they were tactical documents that one side had a pile of chits, the other side had a pile of chits, and there was negotiation between the two of them as to swapping of these chits. That has got to change. The city has to speak its values through all of its collective bargaining agreements, and most importantly through the agreements with the police department. Again, you all know the list of things that need to be changed, but there's a couple that I will highlight. Tanya, I think, alluded to it. We can't keep having a circumstance where if you've been mistreated by the police and you are genuinely fearful of retaliation, that your claim goes nowhere because you don't want to sign an affidavit swearing under penalty of perjury that you have what you said is true. That's got to change, right? We've got to, frankly, push the Bureau of Internal Affairs. We've got to push soon-to-be COPA to use the power that they already have to investigate these allegations, even if there is no affidavit. We have got to fundamentally change the way in which investigations are done. We shouldn't have to give a treatise on allegations to individual officers before we bring them in. And if there's some new facts that develop in the course of an interview, we got to stop the presses, give them new allegations, and then maybe we see them in a month. That's nonsense. That's got to stop. But there's also some little nuggets in there that, again, I can't help focusing on the economic piece of this. For example, we have no idea what officers do in their side jobs. Almost every single one of them has side jobs. But when they make a mistake and they shoot someone, as cases that I've seen in the police board, guess who is on the hook for that? All of you who live here in the city of Chicago. Why is it that the Chicago Police Department is an outlier in police departments across the country that doesn't require officers to get their side jobs approved, to identify what they are, and frankly to take some responsibility that they're going to indemnify the city if they do something on their side job that causes harm and a lawsuit ensues? That's crazy. And that's something that we haven't talked a lot about. But there are a number of different things about the contract. But I think, Tanya has hit it right. People out there in the communities who, particularly young men of color, who are constantly being swept off the street and made to feel like criminals and being criminalized for trivial matters, being held in Cook County with bails that make no sense that they can't meet. When they think about the reality of their lives and they feel like individual officers who shoot or maim are not held accountable, we're never going to get to bridging that gap when that perception of the lack of accountability continues to exist.
We've talked a lot about the accountability piece and some of the other structural elements, but I want to go back to something that Tanya referred to and bring that question to you, T, as we move toward wrapping here, and that is on the front end. What are the best practices and things that effective departments do to recruit, train up, and support officers in a way that makes it much, much more likely that the relationships that they build and the kind of policing that they are engaged in are much more in sync with the kind of public safety model that Tanya is talking about?
Sure. To not get too overly technical, first, police departments start by looking at every selection tool and making sure that whether it's the entrance exam or whatever tool is used to select police officers, that the standards required by that tool validly represent what is required to do police work, so that anybody going through that screen using that tool will have an equal opportunity regardless of what they look like or what their personal characteristics are, as long as they have the ability to do the job as expressed by passing that tool, then the tool is a good tool. Secondly, most departments recognize that you can't recruit different people the same way. That it's much more difficult, generally speaking, to go out and recruit people who are in the community who feel like the police historically have been biased against them. And so whereas for some people you can put a sign on the door saying help wanted and they'll put in applications, for other communities the police have to go out and proactively reach out to them and to try and get them to come in and join the police department. But it can't be a one-shot deal. They have to create relationships with those communities, with every community, to convince those communities that we are authentic about wanting you to become a part of the police. And then they involve citizens in the hiring processes. For example, one police department, as a part of the selection process, has an interview panel. The interview questions were partially designed by the department psychologists, but also by business professionals who are industry professionals in psychological services. They sit on the panel, they are part of that process. They rate the applicants, and they, in fact, by their ratings during the interview process, are part of the overall selection mechanism for those applicants in the process. So those are all the small examples of some things that are happening, but these little bitty things are making a difference in who's been selected and ensuring that those who are selected are representative of the diverse communities within the city. They're making sure by looking at the applicants coming into the door that all of the city demographics are represented in the applicant pool, and then the selection system is fair and unbiased so that everybody who has the capability of doing the job can actually do the job. So,
how close are we to a system like that here in this city?
Not close. It's not rocket science, right? I mean, for example, in New York, a couple of things, and frankly, a lot of departments across the city, or across the country, they invite members of the community in as part of the training for new recruits and veteran officers. Not a novel idea, lots of examples across the country. We need to be doing that here in Chicago. In New York, and I hope this is something, I know the superintendent is enthusiastic about it, but I'm hoping that enthusiasm turns into reality. When new recruits are nearing the end of their time in the academy, their last 2 weeks, excuse me, they go into the neighborhoods and they meet with people in those neighborhoods. Why is that important? What we fear is that recruits who come into the academy from, unfortunately, our very segregated city, where we recruit from segregated neighborhoods, who may be meeting the other for the first time as a peer in the academy, have misperceptions that everybody in a crime-plagued neighborhood is a criminal. What being out in those communities before they hit the streets does, it introduces them to people who are folks of goodwill, who exist in every single neighborhood, no matter how desperate economically or crime-wise, and they get to know them. And they don't see the neighborhood just through the eyes of their field training officer or more senior officers. They make those connections themselves before they hit the street. Very simple thing to do, but and it was part of the task force report. I believe it was also part of the DOJ, but we're not doing that here in Chicago, and we need to.
Tanya, let me give you the last word here. What actions can all of us in this room and across this city take to move us closer to the kind of reality that you'd like to see around this definition of public safety in Chicago?
Well, I think that most of the people in the room are on the front lines with us. So there are community groups here that are fighting for police accountability. They're fighting for a full employment economy. Yeah. They're fighting for, equity in communities of color. They are making sure that we have a responsible budget so that resources are invested in communities that need them most, right? So if everyone is simultaneously engaged in that fight, including public safety officials, including the good cops, the good cops should be on the front line in the fight to transform communities. So I think, that is ultimately what needs to happen in order for us to have communities that are actively and actually safe.
I know we have a long road ahead of us in this process, but I want to thank all three of you so much for helping us chart that way.